Hello, this is Jody Bruns, President of the Divorce Lending Association and the CDLP Certification Program. Thanks for joining me today on our podcast, Divorce Literacy. Our guest today is Melissa Gragg. Melissa provides litigation support services and expert witness testimony for marital dissolution, owner disputes, commercial litigation, business interruption claims, personal damage calculations, lost profits, and personal injury. She also conducts business valuations for purposes of estate planning as well as mergers and acquisitions. Melissa possesses over 20 years of experience in providing valuation and consulting for companies ranging in size from large publicly traded firms to small privately held operations and family limited partnerships. Melissa, thank you so much for joining us today. How are you?
Thank you. Awesome to be here.
Great. Well, I am really excited to do this podcast episode. I was talking to you earlier and said that we haven't done an episode yet on business valuations, especially in a divorce setting. So I'm really excited for our listeners to be able to listen to this today. Tell us a little bit more about your background and how you actually got into this line of work.
Sure. Well, I think I stumbled upon it. So I started my career in selling businesses in mergers and acquisitions. And so I was an investment banker and I was so excited, big money. And then we kind of hit a little bit of an economic situation where we had a little bit of a bust, right? So I got recruited into the accounting field because they said, well, you know how to do market valuations to sell a company. You can probably figure out the rest. And I was like, okay, sounds good. And I started working for accounting firms and then getting some credentials in valuation. It kind of bridged over to divorce just because it's kind of an area that not everybody is completely thrilled about. But my father's a therapist, so I feel like I was in therapy most of my life. And it just kind of dealing with people in this phase of their life I think just came natural to me. And I don't really see divorce as like a good or bad thing. It's just, a choice that you get to make in your life. And sometimes you want to change that choice. So I come in and look at the financial picture, and really serve as like the financial quarterback for people that are getting divorced that typically own something more than a house and 2 cars. They might own a business or a pension or something else, and they're not quite understanding how to split it. So I could work for one party or the other, or I can work for both. And right now, a lot of people just want to work together in some capacity.
Yeah.
Kind of like mediation, but really just financially talking about it, which is not a bad idea because normally you get 2 experts, discussing the value and not agreeing, and you're paying for both experts. So that's kind of what we've been doing lately.
That's pretty awesome. It's really interesting to me as well, because I have that financial background from the business perspective myself. And, so I have my own different way of looking at my clients when they come to me as the divorce mortgage planner and we have business income or we have assets from the business, et cetera. And I see a lot of times in the divorce cases that I work on, we do have a married couple, unfortunately going through a divorce, who during the course of the marriage started a business together. One was more probably operational out in the field doing everything. And one is typically more the office, support. And I see, sometimes where they're going to split up. How the heck are we going to continue to, number one, utilize this business income? Because one party is almost always going to leave the business. But from your perspective and your experience, my first question for you is just that scenario. What if spouses own a business together? Now, all of a sudden, they find themselves going through a divorce. How do you usually see or handle it? The valuation aspect of it, of course, but are they really going to split the business, down the middle? Who's going to retain the business? Is there any chance of them continuing to work together? What do you usually see out there?
Well, it's a great kind of scenario. And so you have the normal divorce that would have, maybe a house and 2 cars, which obviously you still need somebody to help you from a lending perspective. But once you start to put on a business or multiple businesses, or a lot of times even real estate is being held in an LLC, which is
Mm-hmm.
basically a business holding that has a piece of real estate in it. For the most part, every state is very different in how they view a divorce. So one is somebody who gets divorced in another state and tells you a story may not be the best story, right? Because it might be different in your state. So in your state, in the state that I'm in, which is Missouri, and I do a lot of work in the Midwest, Missouri and Illinois and Kentucky and Iowa and all these states. And they're, moderately different, but for the most part, we're not trying to take every asset and split it down the middle. So we're not
Right.
trying to take, 2 tchotchkes. We're not trying to take 2 forks and give one person a fork or one person a spoon or whatever. The house can't be separated. And so, or the business can't be separated. So you're kind of having to deal with what is the value, and then the value gets put on one person's side. And so if the value is 500,000 for the business, then, and the house is worth 500,000, that might be an equal trade. So somebody gets the business and somebody gets the house. And for a lot of people, that is the trade that they're going for,
Really?
right? And so unfortunately, then you have a business valuator come in, and you have the attorneys are already kind of like, okay, I need the value to be this so I can get this, or I need the value to be low so that I don't have to give away things. And that's not really the best way to look at it, because again, you know, would you, like, you have to think of the scenario, you go to court and you say, okay, the business is worth 500,000. And the judge says, great, you're not going to keep it, they're going to keep it, or we're going to sell it. Right now, that they could do, the court could come in, and up until recently, I would have said that that doesn't happen very often, but the court is getting a little frustrated with people not agreeing and not proceeding forward. And so we've had cases recently where the judges are just like, if you guys can't come to an agreement, or, like if you have 2 experts, then we're just going to sell it. If you have a house, and you see this a lot more in real
Yes.
estate right now, you have a house that appraises for 500 and 700, and nobody wants to split it in the middle, right? Because they're like, no, that's not the value. Yet, same with business valuations. There is an art to it. There is pieces of it that are subjective. But for the most part, if they're going to split the business, a lot of times we will see this happen in mediation. And so if you are no longer in the court system, or if you're in the court system, but you try mediation, a lot of states are encouraging people that have child care, or, child support issues, or children, that they do 2 hours of mediation before they go to court.
Right.
If you use that time kind of wisely, and you start to talk about the business, talk about some of these things, there could be ways that if both parties were employed by the business, or even partially employed, I mean, it's got to be a little bit legit, right? That there could be a way that they both maintain that employment, or they both maintain that ownership. But for the most part, where I've seen that is that the parties are going to agree out of court. So they're going to settle that issue, and it can't be egregious. It can't be, okay, I agreed to that price because I got the kids, or, I didn't have to pay maintenance or child support. It has to be reasonable. And so that's where I think the parties don't understand. It's like, I can't just come in and say it's worth nothing or 100 million. The court and the judge is still going to have like logic. Like, do you think that that guy who mows lawns every summer is really worth $100 million? Probably not. So there's that piece of it. But that's in general. If they have a business, they typically have to bring an expert. They can bring one, or they can both hire one if they don't agree, if there's a lot of contentiousness in the divorce. But for the most part, they'll bring an expert. They'll collect the documents. I have conversations sometimes when I'm hired by both with everybody involved, so that we're talking about the business. Usually I have one person that doesn't know anything and one person that thinks they know everything and maybe trying to hide things that are not in their favor. So those are some of the things that we have to be aware of. Even in mediation, you always want to see a document that supports what somebody is saying, as opposed to
Yeah.
just like, I think it's worth 533,000.
So then that leads me to this question. Is there and I know they can get very, very complex. I'm aware of that. But is there like a standard, process that you go through in determining the valuation of a family held business?
Yeah, I mean, it typically is when we're hired, we have a document list. And so it's historical financials. So it's usually like 3 to 5 years of tax returns, financials, operating agreements. When we're hired by both, which I do sometimes recommend, just because you're paying for two experts out of the same pile of money, right? It's all going to be your own money, and you're just kind of paying two people to fight the good fight for each of you. But the reality is somebody that sits in the middle is sometimes impartial. So I'm not really concerned about who's getting what. I'm concerned about that the value I put forth can be reviewed by another valuator, and they would be like, looks okay, right? Nobody's ever going to be like, oh, it's perfect or whatever, but it looks okay. It's reasonable, right? And so when we get into talking about the historical financials, one thing that I do is have that conversation with the business owner, with the spouse. And so they have the opportunity, because a lot of times what we have a spouse saying is like, oh my gosh, best year ever. Like, not necessarily talking about the $500,000 loan that they had to take out in order to make sure that cash flow was happening, right? Because we don't talk about those things yet. Those are actual business things. So in working with somebody, it's talking about like, well, what happened? Why is your income down? Why is your profit down? And in the conversation, we'll start to, if the other person, right, that's not in the business, sometimes, a lot of times they were in the business at one point, right? They did something. They were a secretary, they were a buyer, they were a salesperson. They did something, because these are usually family held businesses in some capacity, right? Or generational businesses. So if they've done something, they have some knowledge of the business. And what you're trying to do is give them an opportunity to ask the questions like, well, that doesn't make sense because I think you're stealing money, or I think you have a girlfriend, boyfriend, and you're spending money on that. So what happens in the business is sometimes personal expenses, or if we're going to hide an expense, would maybe be run through the business. And so in my mind, the more clarity we get about the truth, the numbers are just going to lead us to kind of a range of value that is going to be reasonable. If you want to start to kind of manipulate the numbers, which you can, in order to get to a value, maybe nobody can figure it out very well, but at some point there's going to be another expert, or the spouse's brother's cousin, sister's uncle that did a valuation in 1987, right?
Same with, and their cousin was a mortgage lender too.
Yes. And they bought all the house, like, exactly. So it's like, it's us trying to see through the noise in order to see the value, and then present it to them in a way that they really can't disagree, right? Because I've talked about the history, I've talked about the expenses. Why do you need this? Why is there $40,000 of cell phone expenses? Why are you running $10,000 a month on the credit card? Now, again, all these things could be legit business, like I can go to Ruth's Chris for lunch and take a client, or I can take them to McDonald's. One's going to be $150 and one's going to be $20. I can expense both of them as a meal, right?
Yeah.
So our job isn't really to come in, which I think what parties want, or people who are getting divorced want, is they want us to come in and like find the money, or like, what did they do? That's going to come out in some capacity if it is there. But even when it is there, it's sometimes hard to trace, hard to find, hard to quantify. And then you get to court and the judge is like, so they cheated. And who cares? So it's a difficult, I think, in a divorce, in dealing with getting divorced and you have a business, it really is about talking to some people in the divorce process that understand, like you guys are divorce lending. That's very different. Like anybody can go out and be a lender, but then you have to apply it into the divorce arena. It's the same
Right.
with valuation. I can go value something to go sell it out on the open market at the highest price to a strategic buyer in your industry. But that's not the metric that we value in divorce court. In divorce court, it has to be like somebody off the street doesn't know anything about your business and is going to come in and buy it. What would they buy it on? A lot of times that's cash flow. And so if I can't make, like I give the example, if we had $2 million revenue businesses and one made $1 and one made 950,000 or what did I say? Yeah. And which one would you pick? There's both $1 million revenue businesses, but one is clearly not worth the same as the other. And so in some capacity, we're trying to figure out that. The only other thing that you haven't asked, but it's got something to do with it, is that it's two things in a business. It's value and it's income. Even if it's just income to one party, whether it's the owner or whatever, you have to avoid double counting it. And so you can't do something in the valuation having to do with salary or income for the parties and not replicate it in the divorce. And so that's where I would see games being played, hiding documents, hiding charges in credit card statements and things like that. That's always going to happen. It's just usually people are a little bit more slick with it and you're not going to find a good number. So what we do instead and say, what do you think? You think they spent 20,000, 30,000? Sometimes we encourage the people to go look at the bank statements. Like, let's get them all together. But like, if you and your attorney want to go hunt down go down this rabbit hole, that's great. But then you got to come back and you got to tell me a couple areas. Like I need some big 5,000, 10,000 spends, or else, I mean, think about it. So you went to Ruth's Chris for lunch and you spent $150. You think it's the girlfriend that went, right? But you can't maybe prove it because he does have it written that he went to, a client. So of course you could call the client, like in court, like you could pull the client up. You could say, hey, on random date 2 years ago, did you go to lunch with so-and-so? And they're like, what the heck, man? They're not even going to be showing up to court. They're not going to be interested. But that's how the court doesn't necessarily care either. And they're going to say, can you prove it? So you're going to go back to all those expenses and prove the location of the person, or you go to Walmart. Oh, I know they bought things they went on a trip, right? They went they traveled or something, right? And they bought all these things to travel. It's very hard to prove. So we can quantify it. We can make an adjustment in the valuation. Like, okay, they're running $20,000 worth of expenses. Let's remove that and see what the value looks like. And that's perfect. That's a lot easier than going through like 5 years of bank statements and pulling out 36.15 and 45, and you're not going to know. You're really not going to know unless it's flights or jewelry or big ticket items, which I say use those things to get it settled. Use those things to say, hey, you did these bad things and I want you to give me something over here, right? But usually in court, they're not going to have as much effect.
So let me throw a different little spin on it. How often are you brought in to do a valuation of a business when maybe, let's say, the husband is a part owner in another company where the other spouse has nothing to do with it?
Yeah. Well, so that goes towards how you title a company. And quite frankly, that also then resorts, it funnels down to the state specific kind of rules. Okay. So each state usually has rules or like a statute that will say how you figure out certain types of things for divorce. A lot of times people think if I put my name on it and then it's mine and it's not the other spouse's. And for the most part, you kind of have to realize that if it was created, if it was started in the marriage, it's probably marital.
Correct.
Now, if it was started during the marriage, in order for it to be separate, usually you have to have outside money. So you inherit $100,000, right?
Right.
You put it in the bank and then you take 50,000 and you go and buy the shares of this company. Now, you just have to prove that you took that separate money from the inheritance, you went and bought the shares, and now it's your separate asset. So the summary for that is if it's just titled in one person's name, that not always even matters.
Well, heck yeah. I mean, there's some states where even the increase in value of separate property is considered marital property. So figure you're in one of those states, you had a business, that you started prior to getting married. You now are married and you're going through a divorce, but the valuation of your business has been great because you've been very successful. Now, I would assume it gets really hairy for you because you have to dissect the actual valuation of the business from the time it was separate. And is there an increase in value that is considered marital? It could get really ugly.
Yeah, a couple issues. And so when we're looking at an asset, because we do have family businesses. So in a family business, you will sometimes gift the shares and you'll file a gift tax return and mom or dad will give the shares to the children in some capacity. So that would be then now a separate asset. And we have to kind of look at the shares of a business as the shares of stock. Okay. So you have 5 shares of Apple or whatever company, Coca-Cola. And those 5 shares, typically most states will say, if you get income, interest and dividends, that's going to be marital because any income that you receive from a W-2 or a job is marital, right? So we're going to say, okay, you held this thing, this asset, but it had income that was marital. So we're going to say, okay, now the asset's a little bit bigger, but this outer portion is marital. Ooh, this gets sticky now. Like now we got it all, but do we really, or is it just a layer, right? And so then you're saying, okay, in the capacity of what is separate, then you look at the state may be specific on separate asset appreciation is still separate, or they might say any appreciation is all marital. And those two things being different, saying it's marital, like changes the whole game. And so that's why, and in some cases, there are also states where the income and the appreciation is both separate. So in those states, you're going to have even more of this need to say that this money came in from the beginning and that we kept it. Now, do I see very many financial advisors doing this very well? No. And I think that in general, if you get an inheritance, you literally have to, if you get $100,000 inheritance, right? And you go buy a bunch of stocks, whatever, do whatever you want, right? When those stocks declare dividends or interest, you have it put into a different account.
Yeah.
And then you go buy something else with it, right?
Yep.
But now all that income is in a separate account.
Yep.
And bada boom, you go and get divorced and you have 2 different accounts. Here's the marital, here's the separate. Why nobody does that? Don't know. But that would be like the easiest way to kind of keep them categorically separate. Probably will give your financial planner a heart attack too.
I would think so. In all fairness, when somebody gets married, obviously they never get married with the intent to divorce.
Right.
So when they do take income from like a dividend or something like that from separate property, whatever it is, they almost naturally just put it into their joint marital fund account, bank accounts, because they think they're happily married. And what most people don't realize is that if you want to keep separate property separate, keep it separate.
Yeah.
Don't commingle the funds, because then once you do, almost everywhere, the burden of proof that proving it's separate property is on the shoulders of the person claiming,
Yeah.
that it's separate property.
Well,
And
and quite frankly, when I go in to testify, I am not saying whether an asset is separate or marital per se. That's a legal determination.
right.
But I'm saying that here's the income, here's the appreciation, here's how it's delineated. And just like you said, if you title something in your separate name, it doesn't make it separate. The reverse is also true. If you retitle it in joint names, you are kind of saying to somebody that I am contributing that money or that asset to the marriage.
Yes.
Because by way of me adding my spouse, and now there's two names on it, I am giving you half of that. Now, then you go to court and you're like, no, that wasn't the intent. The intent was never to do that. But again, you've been doing that for 10 years. And so you have to go with the weight of all the evidence, and intent isn't necessarily the bigger issue. It almost becomes like, what was the consistency? Like we see it in businesses, like, do you consistently distribute money, right? Do you consistently pay the owner $250,000? And then in the year or two before marriage, yeah, all of a sudden now there's no money and they get paid $100,000, right? Those facts and circumstances, whether or not they're true or not, lead us to believe that there is manipulation. And so if you don't want, it's almost like you have to make sure that you don't do something that has that eke of manipulation, but you also have to run your business exactly like you would run it, right? And if you continue to do that, when you make decisions that are just like, I have to go buy a $45,000 truck, it doesn't seem like you're going and buying the truck to take the money away from the marriage. Because if you look historically, in November, we always get a new truck. We always trade it in. We always get a new truck. So that factual pattern could go against, but if you don't have that factual pattern and they're just like, oh yeah, I put it in joint names, but that's not what I meant to do. Well, that's usually because they found out now it was not in their best interest. It was what they did. They did, a lot of times these people totally love each other and they do things financially. Quite frankly, more often right now that I'm seeing is more financial abusive situations where one person is cutting off the other person from funds.
Yeah.
And that's also, could happen in any situation. It's not supposed to happen, but you kind of have to be more careful.
I see that a lot, where one spouse is more in control of the finances, the credit cards, everything. And just sometimes out of spite, sometimes out of, I'm going to cut the spending. When they file for divorce, they automatically cut the spouse off from using the credit cards and bank accounts and stuff. And they, obviously we all know that the judges don't like that, for one, that you can't just take the economic, support away from somebody just out of spite or whatever. So there's a lot of things that go on.
It literally violates the law
in
most cases. But I will tell you that that a lot of people, and when you see some business owners that are running very successful businesses, you start to get into like narcissistic behaviors and things like that, where they are the controller of everything. They are the dictator of how the money is spent. I mean, I can't tell you how many times we see estates that have 20 plus million in assets, and we have a spouse that is on a allowance of $500 a week. And so, in some capacities, you have to start planning or being prepared for this. A lot of times it comes out of nowhere. I totally understand. But if you are the out spouse, if you are the spouse that is not in the business or not taking control of some of the finances, one is, and you're happy right now, I would start asking questions. I would start knowing where the money is, how it works, what bills you have, where is it? I mean, what if this person just drops dead tomorrow? Like, what's she
Yeah.
going to do? I'm just saying, I see a lot of things that happen in that capacity too, where it's just like, you don't even know where everything is. So if you start to hear them saying like, why are you asking this? Like, why do you need to know? Okay, that should make your little spidey sense go up and say, why? Because here's the thing is, this is your money. Okay. This is both of your money. This isn't money that has to be given to you. This isn't money that you have to go get. This is yours. This is a way of splitting things that are already owned by you. And so the whole conversation has to start changing into that realm. But, you also have to protect yourself. If you see that your spouse controls all the money, controls all the accounts, you don't have access and you don't have visuals on it, right? And when you ask questions, you're not getting complete answers. I mean, at this point, I have people that have millions in the bank and don't have access to their money and get cut off in some capacity. So what would I do? I mean, you got to get the money out. But
Yeah.
nobody wants to talk about that. And I don't like to recommend it. And no lawyer really wants to recommend it. But, like some of my clients, yeah, you need to take $500,000 out now. You need to put it into a separate account and you need to track do not spend one single cent in cash. Everything has to be traced. Use it for your personal expenses and that's it. Do not do anything else and be able to trace it all back because it's basically an early distribution of and quite frankly, it's probably not allowed. And your attorney might say it's also not allowed. And the fact of the matter is, I see certain population doing this all the time and not caring what the court says. And quite frankly, the court's not coming in to correct it. So that's the bigger issue is that if it happens, you may not have a recourse and you may go for a year or 18 months or 2 years with no access to funding. And the courts could allow it in some capacity. And I'm not saying that it's right. I'm saying it's the reality.
Yeah.
And so I think in that capacity, it's starting to talk to people. Now, remember your accountant, your financial planner, your corporate attorney, they all work for your spouse and you. And they all could go back and say, hey, we met with your wife and she wants to figure out blah, blah, blah. Okay. I mean, again, you might want to seek some outside advice. I would always say to talk to professionals. Your stories from your friends cannot be replicated and they are probably not true because your friends don't want to say, the stuff that happens inside the court and then potentially consider mediation. If you can even have rational communication, if there's, sometimes we have special needs children that are just going to require a different way of looking at it. Right. And in mediation, you have more control over the process. You have more capability to have creative ideas. But that takes both spouses wanting to do it. And that's, not always the case unless you go back and say, well, we can pay 2 people to do it or we can pay 1.
Yeah.
And sometimes that works. So,
I could keep this conversation going so long. It's so interesting to me. And I just love, hearing the stories because I can apply what you're saying to different cases, that I've been involved in. And unfortunately, there's so many more of these cases out there that they need, experts like you, involved. Now my question is, I know you're in Missouri, you do work in Illinois, most likely probably Kansas too, since you're right there, but do you work, you're not held by state boundaries, are you?
no, as an expert, typically your attorney is going to work in a specific state, but the experts, and it could be a variety of experts because there are also different experts that value property and real estate and things like that. But typically we can work anywhere. And it just depends on how we travel for court. So during the pandemic, a lot of courts went online. So there was a lot, everybody was online, so it wasn't a big deal. Now we still travel, but it's usually just a day. And we go in for the trial or a deposition or something like that. Quite frankly, I think people are more willing to do like a video deposition nowadays, especially on bigger cases. But it's really just looking at, does it make sense? Do you all get along?
Mhm.
Can you have a discussion? And is there a rational way? The house sometimes gets in the way if somebody can't afford it. And that's where we pull in. We have a local person that I talk to that's in the Divorce Lending Association, Emily Flowers, and she's
Yep.
amazing. And she can come in and help them figure out the house piece, because sometimes that's, one person needs to stay in it with the kids and doesn't have the income. But, it's really just looking at holistically the bigger picture, and is there an efficient way to get this done?
Yeah.
And if you're both willing to do it, I think there are ways, and you can get a lot of assistance, and it will be cheaper. But mediation always isn't always faster, because
Yeah.
again, like I think the frustrating portion of the divorce is in general is just the time it takes. But most of the time it's because one person maybe didn't want to get divorced and one person does.
That's true.
So you see a lot of pullback. I see a lot of people go, as we were talking internally yesterday, when we see clients that really want to go after all the expenses that somebody spent on a significant other in the marriage, I usually can turn to them and say, you didn't want to get divorced, did you?
Mm.
And they'll say, how did you know? And I was like, well, when you want out, you're going to leave with like the shirt on your back. And when you're being pushed out, you're going to be pulling everything that you can to either try to stay in, right? Or just to get as much out as you can. And most of the time, I don't see people trying to get as much as they can, especially women. I think they'll walk away from things. But I think for the most part, they're just making sure that it is reasonable, and they're not, like when I come in the middle, both people are just kind of like, I don't want to get screwed by you. I don't like you anymore. I still probably have to like co-parent or be friends with you. Maybe I still love you, but we can't be, but for the most part, they cannot figure out if they're getting screwed or not. And at the end of the day, if you find out 5 days later that you got screwed, you're going to feel like you got screwed. It doesn't matter. And so in some capacity, we have to make sure that you don't have that feeling inside, like you get all the questions asked. And, the process wasn't built for the people, it was built for the court system. And so, we just have a little lag in fixing some of the issues at this point.
Well, Melissa, if someone wanted to get in touch with you for more information, maybe they need your services, how could they find you online to get your contact information?
Yeah. So we have a website, Valuation Mediation, that really gears towards people that are in this situation that want to hire one valuator. And we have a podcast that has a lot of information about valuations. And then we offer a 30-minute or a 60-minute conversation, because when you're hiring somebody, it's a process. Like you might be involved with them for like 6, 12, 18, 2 years. Sorry, but that's just the truth. Even post pandemic. So you kind of want to make sure you have a good team and it's the right fit. It's the right personality. We want to make sure we can be of value to you. So we usually talk about the situation, make sure that it's the right fit, and then determined to move forward. And sometimes a person in your area is going to be best, right? They might know the court system. They might know the judges. They might know the attorneys. So sometimes I'm even just sourcing them back to, like recently we had a patent valuation issue, and I was too busy, and it was from a referral in Florida. And I tossed it over to like one of the most amazing people that could handle it. So I think that as we move forward, I think that's what people are doing. I have a very efficient lane that I work in, and sometimes moving outside of that scope there could be somebody that's just like valuation of a dental practice in a certain area. Maybe I have a perfect person and then I would refer that person. So it's got to be a right fit in general.
Well, awesome. Melissa, thank you so very much for joining us today. And I look forward to collaborating with you on other projects in the future.
Thank you so much. I appreciate getting to know all of you and actually using your services in client work. It's really exciting. So
Thank you very much. We appreciate all that support.
yes.